I think that I should issue a health warning. Those who work in the Antarctic field have an inordinate fondness for acronyms. So I must warn you that along with hypothermia and or being bitten by a leopard seal, Antarctica exposes you to the risk of chronic Antarctic acronym fatigue syndrome, or I might say CAFS. Antarctica has long occupied a special place in people's minds, but the reasons for that are different for different people. For some people, it's the history of the exploration of Antarctica, the heroic expeditions of people like Scott and Amundsen and Shackleton and Mawson, being a sort of 20th century reprise of the great age of African and Central Asian exploration, which so captured the imagination of Victorian England. For others, Antarctica is remarkable as a physical place. The last remnant of the ancient continent of Gondwanaland. I prefer Gondwanaland to Gondwana, it's more poetic. Surrounded by the only ocean to circulate around the entire globe, Antarctica is the highest, driest, windiest and coldest continent on Earth. And encircling Antarctica, like a necklace, are groups of sub-Antarctic islands which comprise a distinct domain whose ecological and geological characteristics are so special that 3 of them are World Heritage Sites and a 4th is being considered. For yet other people, the source of their interest is Antarctic science. Originally mainly concerned with the properties of the continent and the region around it, Antarctic science has now developed into truly global science, which has advanced the understanding of entire scientific domains and is making increasingly significant contributions to our understanding of the global climate system and the prediction of climate change. But in addition to its remarkable history, its physical characteristics and the impressive science which is done there, Antarctica has another dimension, a dimension which is just as important and just as interesting. Over the years, Antarctica has developed a distinct culture which I suggest is unique in the history of human societies. Now let me start by sketching the prologue to the emergence of that culture. Although Captain Cook circumnavigated Antarctica in the 1770s, the first confirmed sighting of the continent itself was not made until about 1820. Although, having said that, there is in existence a rather mysterious map made as long ago as 1531 by a French mathematician named Oronce Fine, which fairly accurately depicts what appears to be Antarctica. Now, unfortunately for those of us who are fond of arcane theories about extensive secret medieval knowledge, the probable explanation is that Fine included this feature in his map because of the theory that the continents of the northern hemisphere needed to be balanced with a great southern landmass of equivalent size, otherwise the world would tip over. In other words, Fine inserted Antarctica simply because he thought it ought to be there. But whatever was the exact date when Antarctica first entered human consciousness, it was an immensely long time after the other continents did. Following the migrations of our ancestors from Africa to Eurasia, Australia, North America and finally South America, another 12,000 years were to pass before the last of the continents, Antarctica, was discovered. It's strange to think that for all that time, while mankind was so active everywhere else in the world, this enormous mass of rock, ice and water comprising the 7th continent on Earth remained undiscovered and undisturbed. But once Antarctica had been discovered, exploration inevitably followed. Initially, the motivation for the exploration of Antarctica was little different from that which had driven the exploration of the Pacific and Australian regions generally. The Voyages of Discovery in the 18th and early 19th century had a variety of overlapping objectives. While these usually included the discovery of resources or the acquisition of new territory, they were also scientific voyages concerned with gaining new knowledge of all kinds: geographic, botanical, zoological, astronomical, and what we would call anthropological. Now, the 19th century exploration of Antarctica was essentially no different. While the purpose of many voyages was for the exploitation of resources such as seals and whales, important scientific expeditions were also undertaken. Admiral Bellingshausen's navigation of Antarctica in 1820 was made in the course of a scientific investigation and expedition sent out from Russia by Tsar Alexander I. This was followed over the next 20 years by other important scientific and geographic expeditions, including those of Dumont d'Urville and James Clark Ross, who both spent time in Tasmania. At the end of the century, a scientific party under Carsten Borchgrevink was the first to overwinter on the Antarctic continent. That voyage too has Tasmanian connections, the Tasmanian Louis Bernacchi being a member of that expedition. And incidentally, in the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, you can find one of Borchgrevink's sleds, almost certainly the oldest piece of Antarctic land transport in the world. So, from a very early stage, the exploitation of resources was not the only motive for Antarctic expeditions. Geographic and scientific exploration played an increasingly significant role too. And it was during the 19th century that Antarctica started to come into prominence in the consciousness of the community generally. This was particularly apparent in Tasmania, then as now, as I've said, a major centre of Antarctic endeavours. Hobart welcomed and gave logistic support to Antarctic voyages. The Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Franklin, built a geomagnetic observatory for Ross when he called into Hobart en route to the South Magnetic Pole. And the Royal Society of Tasmania published Antarctic scientific papers and promoted Antarctic science and exploration. On the creative arts side, Christopher Spotswood published in Launceston an Antarctic novel entitled The Voyage of Will Rogers to the South Pole. And in 1841, what was advertised as an Antarctic drama was produced in Hobart. It was a blend of fact and fiction. The Antarctic and Arctic explorers portrayed were indeed real people, but the 5-foot penguins which they encountered were not quite as authentic. It was clearly theatre in the grand tradition. In the closing scene, it was reported, 3 female figures impersonating Britannia, fame and science descended in glory. As the travellers knelt, science crowned them with laurels and fame sounded the trumpet, accompanied by a full chorus singing Rule Britannia. Now, I have to acknowledge that production has not come down to us as an especially distinguished part of our theatrical history, but it probably was the first Antarctic play produced anywhere in the world, and it must have been in tune with the mood of the time in Hobart because it attracted a full house. But although Antarctica was regarded as a special place, its early history followed a depressingly familiar pattern. With more and more countries evincing an interest in Antarctica, the first half of the 20th century witnessed what threatened to become a possibly violent scramble for Antarctic territory, which has been likened to the scramble for Africa by European nations which had taken place in the 19th century. Australia's participation in that scramble, whilst not aggressive, was certainly done with an imperial flourish. The drama was encapsulated by the historian Tom Griffiths in one characteristically graphic sentence. On the 13th of January 1930, Professor Griffiths recounts, Sir Douglas Mawson and a party of men landed on a small rocky island of eastern Antarctica, climbed to its summit, built a cairn, erected a flagpole, raised the Union Jack, read an official proclamation at noon, placed a document in a canister in the cairn, attached a tablet asserting sovereignty, took off their caps, gave 3 cheers and sang God Save the King. And to put the efficacy of that assertion of sovereignty beyond all doubt, 12 days later, Mawson flew over the ice sheet in a Gypsy Moth biplane, read the proclamation again, and speared a Union Jack attached to a pole into the ice sheet below. Griffiths also reports that, not to be outdone at the end of that decade, Adolf Hitler's Germany sought to secure its position as an Antarctic claimant state by sending a plane to bomb Antarctic ice with hundreds of cast-iron swastikas, each carefully counterbalanced so that it stood upright on the surface. By the 1950s, 7 countries had claimed sovereignty over various sectors of the continent, some of them overlapping, while 5 others were undertaking Antarctic expeditions without lodging formal territorial claims, although some over-enthusiastic expeditioners made claims without the authority of their governments. But then events took a truly historic turn. Encouraged by the success of the 1957 International Geophysical Year, a very large global collaborative scientific program which included a particular focus on Antarctica, the idea of a treaty governing Antarctic affairs started gaining momentum. It was agreed that a series of meetings would be held as a prelude to a conference to be held in Washington in 1959, at which it was planned that the terms of an Antarctic treaty would be settled. At first, the prospects were not promising. There were opposing views about fundamental issues such as freedom of science, the use of military personnel in Antarctica, the duration of the treaty, and of course the crucial issue of sovereignty. But eventually, as the result of a lot of creative and principled diplomacy, all those issues were resolved and agreement was reached on a treaty which provided that Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only, guaranteed freedom of scientific investigation, facilitated cooperation and the free exchange of information and personnel, prohibited nuclear explosions, and put on hold all claims to Antarctic territory or objections to the territorial claims of others. United in diversity, Ambassador Oscar Pinochet de la Barra from Chile later wrote, "We created in those autumn days in Washington a product of simple common sense, helped by a secret key, consensus." Well, since its inception in 1959, the Antarctic Treaty has not merely survived, but has flourished, and it has proved to be what is arguably the most successful international regime in history. But over that time, a good deal more has been achieved than just the successful implementation of the treaty. We've also seen the vindication of the philosophy and aspirations which inspired the treaty, and the emergence of a coherent complex of institutions and practices and values which collectively comprise a truly distinct culture. That culture is manifested in various ways. One of its hallmarks is that Antarctic governance is conducted through decisions arrived at by consensus. Consensus decision-making has been criticised on the grounds that it makes institutions vulnerable to what's been described as consensus paralysis, or at least makes them subject to the law of the least ambitious proposal. But however true that may be in other spheres, it has not proved to be the case in Antarctic affairs. As I've noted already, the extraordinary achievement of creating the treaty itself was the product of consensus decision-making. And the requirement that decisions by the treaty parties must be made by consensus has not prevented those parties from making a large number of effective and far-reaching practical decisions governing a wide range of topics, including scientific cooperation, the protection of the Antarctic environment and historic sites, logistics, communications, transport and safety, the conservation of plants and animals, the management of tourism, the management of meteorological data, fisheries management and much else. The consensus model has also conferred positive benefits by better ensuring acceptance of and compliance with decisions by all treaty parties, regardless of their interests or their status within the system. The special nature of the Antarctic culture is also apparent in the character of the institutions and organisations which have been created by or as a result of the Antarctic Treaty. One of the most impressive institutions created as part of the Antarctic Treaty system is the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or I issue an acronym alert, CAMLR. CAMLR is the largest international organisation domiciled in Australia, and indeed for quite a long time it was the only significant international organisation which had its headquarters in Australia. And of course it's of special interest because its secretariat is located here in Hobart. CAMLR is responsible for implementing the convention of the same name, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. Entering into force in 1982, the purpose of that convention is the conservation and sustainable utilisation of marine living resources in the Antarctic region. CAMLR is widely acknowledged as a model of civilised international regulation and environmental management. In sharp contrast to, say, the International Whaling Commission, which has the same mission in respect of whales as CAMLR has in respect of marine living resources, CAMLR's decisions and policies are solely concerned with fulfilling its obligations under the Convention and are fully informed by the advice of its scientific committee. CAMLR's achievements are impressive. It has consistently followed a policy of addressing potentially damaging situations before excessive exploitation has taken place. It was the first marine living resources regime to address the management of a complete ecosystem rather than just individual species. The first to apply the precautionary principle in a workable, scientifically rigorous way. And more broadly has been a leader in devising processes for giving effect to an international regime through domestic laws and administrative arrangements. CAMLR is a very fine manifestation of the philosophy of the Antarctic Treaty system in action, observed the Executive Secretary of CAMLR earlier this year. Its work, he went on, is informed neither by the greed of those who would excessively exploit the Southern Ocean, nor by the zealotry of the uncompromising conservationist, but by rational, civilised discussion based upon the results of sound scientific research. Given that history, it's not surprising that amongst regional fisheries organisations the world over, CAMLR is widely regarded as a pioneering leader. Of course, it has to be acknowledged that illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing still presents a large problem in Antarctic waters, but that reflects more the magnitude of the task rather than inadequacies in CAMLR. And there is now strong evidence to suggest that measures which have been put in place by CAMLR over the years have had a positive effect, with recent declines in illegal fishing in the CAMLR area being a consequence. Another organisation which reflects the special qualities of the Antarctic culture is the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs, COMNAP. Each consultative party to the Antarctic Treaty has in one form or another a national Antarctic program which has responsibility for the management of their country's activities in the Antarctic region. Created in 1988, COMNAP comprises the directors or nominated representatives of those programs. Now, given that the members of COMNAP are employed by or are at least responsible to the governments of their countries, one would expect that the primary role of its members would be to advance the interests of the countries they represent. But in fact, COMNAP's primary objectives are not nationally oriented at all, but are devoted to advancing the endeavours of the whole international Antarctic community by, and I quote, serving as a forum to develop practices that improve the effectiveness of activities in an environmentally responsible manner, facilitating and promoting international partnerships, providing opportunities and systems for information exchange, and providing the Antarctic Treaty System with objective, practical, non-political advice drawn from the National Antarctic Programme's pool of expertise. COMNAP is a busy, hard-working council with interactions at all levels of the operational spectrum. For example, its activities in just 1 year, 2008, included search and rescue coordination, review of the Antarctic Flight Information Manual, accident reporting, hydrographic surveying, long-term monitoring activities, and support of the International Polar Year. It's widely acknowledged by the operators and managers involved that COMNAP does a good deal more than just coordinate the contributions by national programs. It adds significant value to them and achieves more than any one country could accomplish alone. An example is a current COMNAP proposal to establish an East Antarctic logistics network, which will involve, amongst other things, the collaborative use of national shipping and air assets. Now, this is a project with really significant ramifications, and last year a most productive workshop involving the Australian, French, Italian, Chinese, Russian, Indian, Romanian, Korean and Japanese national programs was held in Shanghai to advance it. Another organisation which reflects the distinctive nature of the Antarctic culture is the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, SCAR. Since the inception of the Antarctic Treaty, SCAR has had official observer status and been one of the principal sources of scientific advice at Antarctic Treaty meetings. It's played a major role in promoting cooperative scientific programs and made numerous recommendations on a large variety of matters, most of which have been incorporated into Antarctic Treaty instruments. Now, given that the doing of science is a core, perhaps the core, Antarctic activity, obviously SCAR is a very important and significant component of the Antarctic Treaty System. It's therefore remarkable to find that SCAR was not created by the Antarctic Treaty System, nor is it even a government organisation. In fact, SCAR is a committee of the International Council for Science, which is a non-government association of national and international scientific bodies whose mission is, quite simply, and I quote, to strengthen international science for the benefit of society. Founded in 1931, it is one of the oldest international NGOs in the world. Now, remembering that the Antarctic Treaty System and its institutions are international arrangements or entities which were created by national governments, the fact that such an important source of advice to the treaty parties on the primary activity which they undertake, science, is a committee of an international NGO is another illustration of the unique character of the Antarctic culture. And it should be emphasised that the scientific cooperation of the kind which SCAR promotes is not just an abstract ideal. It's been given concrete and productive expression in hundreds of collaborative projects across all the scientific disciplines. Let me give a current example. Until recently, the area around the highest point on the Antarctic ice sheet, known as Dome Argus or Dome A, was one of the least explored regions on Earth. It's a region of great geological interest because of the discovery that located beneath it is a mountain range remarkable both for its size, it's as large as the European Alps, and remarkable for the fact that its existence and nature are hard to reconcile with current theories about tectonic processes. Now, the range was first discovered by Soviet scientists in 1958. Over the years since, its features have been investigated in more detail by a collaborative program between German and Australian expeditions, and then by an even larger program involving Australia, Germany, the United Kingdom, China, Japan and the United States. But that's not the end of the story. Earlier this year, China began operating its Antarctic Kunlun station, and one of its missions is to continue the work of investigating and mapping this mountain range under Dome Argus. The history of the discovery and collaborative investigation of that region, spanning more than 50 years and continuing, is a good example of the sort of international cooperation which characterises Antarctic science.